We're very grateful to have David Harris. He's one of, I gather, three members of a subcommittee led by Adam. Are you head of the subcommittee about history?
I am. I'm the chair of that little piece of it. Yes.
Yep. You all know Adam's had a particular interest in Govans history with the cemetery and more broadly in the church as a whole and its role in black-white racial relations over the years, sometimes constructive and all too sadly often destructive. If any of you have seen the Baltimore Sun editorial this morning, you'll know that the history, for example, of the Sun of 175 years, that for 150 years of it, they were mainly obstructionist or actively racist, and they're trying to make amends. And the Racial Justice Ministry Working Group is this church's, I guess, effort to do something similar. And I can't speak so knowledgeably about it, so I'll be quiet and simply introduce David and let David do the talking. David Harris, born in Texas, went to college in Maryville, Tennessee. That's how you pronounce it. And then the seminary, and ultimately came here to Baltimore in 1971. He became an associate minister at Faith Church, and he's had various responsibilities at various churches over the years. He and Bonnie joined Govans in part because they had two young sons and they wanted their sons to have a church closer by. And Jack Sharp got his talons into David. Those of you who know Jack know exactly what I mean. Jack Sharp was the minister at the time, and for 20 plus years had a big agenda in this neighborhood. And he hired David as a parish associate. And so David and Bonnie have had association with us ever since then of all sorts of important roles. And the latest, and what we'll be hearing about this morning, is the history investigation that he and Myra have been leading together with Adam. Myra's been focusing on the history starting 1844 and perhaps before of this church's involvement in racial issues, negative and positive. So she's been digging through the archives, and she'll be sharing a lot of those very interesting stories and insights, things I've never heard before, next week. And David's been doing the recent history since the 1950s, and through the method of oral histories. And so he's going to present a couple slides and talk about some of the things he's found. David asked me to emphasize that this is a work in progress. We're really just getting going, and I imagine the committee is very open to suggestions of sources and nooks and crannies to look in, people to talk to. So this is something that you'll hear about again. Next month or so, the other subcommittees of the Racial Justice Ministry Working Group will be having sessions to talk about what they're doing. We'll have a visit on March 20th by the Episcopalian diocesan archivist, who the Episcopal Diocese has been taking some leadership in digging up and understanding its role, just as the Baltimore Sun did this morning in perpetuating racial injustice, and then later on, hopefully some positive things as well in the civil rights movement, and then looking forward. She has a lot of interesting things to say to us. So, David, I'm going to make you I'm going to enable you to screen share, and it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Ben. I want to mention SPIN has several subcommittees. One that's doing a newsletter that you can get, and we'll get you that information. It's coming out in the bulletin and online all the time. The one important one, other one that I want to mention is the group that works on policy. And if you read your bulletin or not tidings, but our newsletter, you'll see that the session just adopted 3 documents from 3 pieces from the Racial Justice Ministry Group. One is a statement, which at some point we'll go into, about Govans' stance in anti-racism. Another one was that there would be changes in the hiring policy to assure equity. And the third one is the whole sessions to start, maybe we'll move to the congregation is going to go through some racial training on racism. And Maria Wong is our representative on session, liaison, she's on session, and she can talk about that. But I call your attention because it just passed this week unanimously I don't know unanimously, but passed all 3. So I'm going to go into some of my interviews. I started interviewing people I could get a hold of, and I could get some from the 40s, but I if I'd done this 10 years ago, I could have gone a lot further back, I think, but those folks have gone on to their reward and they're not available any longer. So I'll be covering that. I want to start with saying Govans is a paradox to me in terms of racial justice. Govans started out being very, very similar to almost all of white Presbyterian congregations in the US. I was involved in several growing up in youth presbytery and visited others and have learned about them over time. But there was relative passive stance in terms of race, some claimed they weren't open and some people of color were turned away. In other situations, they'd say we're open, but no one would come because people of color would know they weren't welcome, as well as just other typical behaviors. A guy named Jones, whose first name I can't remember at the moment, wrote a great book of White Too Long. And in that book, he talks about how the Protestant church and Catholic churches were mostly white, and they were the most important bastion of racism in the United States. And that's something we've got to own up to and live into. Now Govans has moved to another stance, not just active, but we're taking a stance that you must be anti-racist in order to accomplish things. And that means looking into your past, engaging in all kinds of things of racial justice. And it's not just the idea that, oh, we got to integrate Govans. That's been going for a while. But we know, and at least for now, most white churches will only have marginal involvement of people of color. And that's something we're working on, but that's sure not everything racial justice. And that's not the point of our ministry for racial justice. It's just one element of it. So Govans historically was conservative, segregationist for a long time, including mostly into even the 40s and 50s. There are a lot of members who left, moved out further to the county, white flight. And I'll tell you about an occasion that gave them the excuse to move to churches further out. But part of it was for some of them, they saw integration possibly coming, the change in the neighborhood and the city. And so they found a way to leave. Some left over what the crisis was, but a lot of them underneath had these other forces pushing them too. So Leah will give an overview of all of our work when she returns. So look forward to that, and she'll cover the waterfront. So I'll just focus on the interviews that we had. So let's see if I can screen share here. I don't have screen share on my thing, Ben.
Let's see. Here
it is. Never mind.
Okay.
I found. It was a different color. Let's see if this shares. Okay. Can you all see a slide about the pastors of Govans?
Nice. Very nice.
All right. Reverend Dr. Lloyd Ice came in 1941. And really, that's sort of when we have our first little bits of information. And he was pastor here for a very long time. I'd like for you to notice, and this may be important, he was born in the 19th century. He had been a minister elsewhere and got his honorary doctorate. It was honorary in those days. And he came to Govans in 41 and stayed all the way until 67. What's important if we get into any involvement in racial justice, we really need to focus on two associate pastors who were there during his time. Well, three actually, George Landis, Don Bracken, and Bill Bryant, who came 62 to 68. He was first assistant pastor, then associate pastor, then co-pastor, and finally near the end, I think in 67 or 68, 68, I guess it was, he became the pastor. So that, I didn't break that all down, but you can see there. So he was one of the associates and then became co-pastor and then pastor for a short time. Art Nelson was there in the beginning of the 70s. And then Jack Sharp came, and he then had the next longest tenure. He was here from 77 to 04. Tom Harris came, and I only looked this up lately. It's 26 or 27. I think it's 27. Unless, does anybody know exactly who's out there? You could share.
December 2006.
Is it a shock to, see how long it's been when you see numbers like
Just yesterday.
that?
All right, so it's 2006. All right, whoops. Let's go back. I didn't mean to do that. All right, now I'm going to stop for a bit. You can have this slide as your in the background, and it's in the recording, and I can provide it for anybody who wants it. But I'm sort of going to focus on that and the eras, which break down somewhat into decades, starting in 1940, when Dr. Ice came. And just for you to know, I may embarrass Beth, but she was baptized, confirmed, and married by Dr. Ice. So she had good experience, and he was a pastor she admired and loved. And he was the classic pastor in those days, focused mostly on pastoral care and leading worship and preaching the sermon. It was the associates who got involved with youth and other things, and they were the ones who had some positive impact, or the beginning sort of seeds of Govans engaging on a slow path towards racial justice. And it was, just seeds, just small things. I have to say, as I said before, most of the congregation was conservative theologically and conservative politically. And there was a good portion, we can't measure it exactly, who were really for segregation, at least in their churches. So in the 40s, the church grew a lot because people moved to Baltimore to work in the Second World War effort. And they came as young families and came to Govans, and then they stayed in Baltimore after the war. So Govans was a growing congregation in the 1940s, but as you might imagine, there was, as far as I can discern, not much happening in the way of racial justice involvement. Then we go to the 50s, and particularly there was lots of growth, as most churches were doing in the 50s. And there was two major fundraisers, which were huge: June Fest the Oyster Bazaar. Then there were a couple of directors of Christian Ed who helped with the Sunday school. And then in 54, Reverend George Landis came to the church, and he had a fairly large group in the 20s. Now, he initiated several things in the area of exploring racial relations, whether it be racial justice or not. The Presbytery youth, because of African American churches, the Presbytery youth had retreats and gatherings and so on, and they were integrated. And that was really a lot of people's first exposure to that. George also pushed discussions that had to do and be involved with race. And he either had one visitation that Beth could tell you more about, when she was chosen or volunteered to call an African American bar to see if they could go visit. I don't know what all is behind that, but she called and they said yes, and I think they went. But they were seeking to get exposure. That's also when Govans became very involved with the McKinn Center, which during the 50s was integrated. It later became almost all African American, but in that time it was. And Beth and some of the youth went down there and did work camps, established relationships that continued for a long, long time. And that began in the 50s. And there were other initiations too. I would say the main focus in that area was youth group discussions and questions and topics that Reverend Landis raised in that area. Otherwise, Govans was the best, you could say, was passive, not antagonistic, but members a lot were very antagonistic and segregationist. And we have to own that. Others do too, but we just need to focus on ourselves and own that was sort of the climate in that time. The next associate pastor who came was Don Bracken. And one of the things he's known for is some of the same things that Reverend Landis did. But when I met with the three of the people I interviewed, Beth and Bill Arminger, her brother, and Jim Addy, this last Friday, we had lunch together to sort of talk and give me some more context of Govans. They talked about that he was a minister who really pushed the youth to question things. It was really big that no question was wrong, and it was good to challenge your faith and your understanding of things and so on. And that was at a time when people were beginning to focus on that there's racial injustice in this world. The white people got clear on and began to gain information about it.
David, there's a question in the chat from Lisa about what you meant by members being segregationists during the 1950s. I mean, what did that practically mean?
One is they were segregationist in terms of membership in the church. There's a story I'll get into where a woman came to Govans and was turned away, an African-American woman. The end of that story is fascinating. Years later, her son joined the youth group. It joined a Bible school in the summer and then joined the youth group, joined the church. Then his brother joined the church. And then she, that woman who had been turned away, joined the church, and her family did. And they were the first people to integrate Govans.
I think they were the Harpers, weren't they? Janie Harper?
Yes, and I'm not sure, was that in the 60s, Kit?
Well, I don't know, I wasn't here then, but I've heard the story, and I believe it was Janie Harper was the little girl who came with her mother and was turned away. And then later, that's how I heard it, but that's just the way it could be really wrong.
And Myra, in terms of your other thing, a lot of the people, to be honest, were for segregation, not only in the church, but period, segregation in society. Don't know the numbers and don't know the division. Some would say they weren't for segregation in the South, blah, 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 but they weren't very interested or were anti Govans integrating. So there's those two types of integration that went on. Then we go to another associate, Bill Bryant, who came in the 60s and 62. And he got somewhat involved in openness to discussions and consideration. And when I interviewed him, he talked mostly about he saw the future that was coming towards Govans. Now, interestingly, he also made it very clear that in that time, the neighborhood was not really integrated. There were two sections of African Americans in the neighborhood, and they were people who worked in the homes of white people in Homeland and further up the road in Cedarcroft and on up in there. And there were two pockets. One was just, I think, barely in the county in the South, and then one that was really in Govans' neighborhood. And there were African-American churches, and that's where they went. But he would say one of the reasons there wasn't much activity is it wasn't there until, as the civil rights came and Beth and others became involved, then there was other activity in that area, and Govans youth mainly and young adults, some of them really became involved.
This is a quick question from Adam and Beth, everyone. So
Beth was married to Bill Bryant's brother, Barry. And Barry was on the research committee that brought in Jack Sharp. So Beth was Bill Bryant's, became Bill Bryant's brother-in-law when she was married in the church in 1965.
Okay, what's the question, Ben?
Which was, please remind us of Bill and Beth Bryant's relationship, spouses, siblings.
Bill answered that. I mean, Bill Arminger best answered that. All right, and I'm going to be jumping around a little, but let me just sort of finish the real flow of the 60s. In 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated, and there were big time riots in Baltimore. And Govans, interestingly, it'll give you the flavor of the context. Govans was an area in which National Guard troops bivouacked to protect the people further north from the riots going further north into the county. And they patrolled the area and were there. And that really, that whole activity really shook Govans up and so on. And it was even found out that there was a loaded shotgun out in the cemetery or somewhere, and people were really afraid. But that was sort of the context, but it was, it was a wake-up call too. I mean, people had very negative reactions, and others, it drew them into what's really going on in the world. Let me share my second slide as we get into the 60s and so on. Oops, all right. Okay, here's some key points where Govans got involved in ministries with people of color. I already mentioned McKim in 1956. That started that relationship down in the city. Head Start started here at Govans in 1966, but they wanted the funding to go further south in the city. So Govans founded the nursery school in 1967, and it was integrated. Then there's things that go on later on with the coming of Jack Sharp, and since there are slides up, I'll just mention them now. I'm jumping ahead. Epiphany Home was founded in 1985. Ascension House was founded because a person with special needs in mental health or mental problems, and I don't mean psychological, but brain problems. They couldn't find a place for him until they went down to 25th Street and took care of him. And Jack said, we need a place in our neighborhood. And the first Ascension home was started in 1988. CARES, which is our food pantry, started in 93. GEDCO, which is another major initiative of Jack, became an ecumenical group of churches in Govans, racially integrated, people of color, and those churches were involved, as well as the Roman Catholic Church and Jack, and lots of activity started out in the community with that, including more homes that were established, finally ending in them winning the battle for Stadium Place when the old stadium was torn down, and they won out over Johns Hopkins that wanted it for its campus stuff and medical school and hospital, and Mayor Schaefer, who wanted it for business development. And everyone said, you can't beat those two, but Jack Sharp and the ministers who organized did. And they built Stadium Place for senior citizen housing, as well as the other homes. There are others that aren't even listed, like Hartford House. And Stadium Place is for low-income elderly people, as the others are, and it is predominantly people of color. It's integrated. Gallagher Mansion in 97 and Micah House in 98, and those are just some of them. So we'll get a little more into those, but I'll just finish them there. And as I mentioned in the 60s, there was Bill Bryant continued encouraging the youth to think outside the box, and included discussions of being involved with the racial justice that was getting started in America big time. Art Nelson came, well, let me back up. Bill Bryant became co-pastor with Dr. Ice, who was in his 70s, at Dr. Ice's initiation. And then they rewarded Dr. Ice when on his 25th anniversary at Govans with a trip to the Holy Land. And the movement was that he was getting near retirement and that Bill would take over. So when he came back, Bill became co-pastor with the intention of him becoming pastor. And just as it was about to happen, Dr. Ice got up and gave a speech condemning Bill and calling him Silver-Tongued Bryant.
It was a sermon. It wasn't a speech, it was a sermon.
Sermon, excuse me, that just rocked the congregation. And then he was refusing to let Bill become pastor. And they voted, and only one person objected to Bill becoming pastor. So Dr. Ice left, walked out, never came back. So it was a horrendous ending. And that was the time when a lot of people used that excuse to move to churches near them because they lived way out in the county, including Chestnut Grove, Havenwood, others. I don't know if anybody went to what was now Brown is a part of us out there, Brown Woodbrook, but probably so. But they used that, and there was a variety of reasons, from just frustration with what had happened, and even more left when Bill left after a couple of years. But a lot of them saw the change in the neighborhood, et cetera, and were part of the white flight that just got out. And of course, the one thing was that meant that there were more progressive people left at Govans, but they were really struggling. Treading water is what I heard on Friday. And that's when Art Nelson came from 69 to 76. And he was a real introvert. real buttoned down Presbyterian ministers, big on intellectual sermons and the type, but not really involved much at all in any community kind of ministry. He really focused in the traditional minister role. However, at the time, Jim Addy came and he brought in two big time African Americans to speak to the adult options class. Clarence Blount, who was a state senator, assistant principal at Dunbar, and had also been in this, on the state school board, or state school administration, excuse me. He also brought in Enola McMillan, who later became head of the NAACP here in Baltimore, and then the head of the national NAACP. And they spoke, were fairly well received, but nothing much happened. And Art, as was his usual case with adult options, was polishing his sermon in his office. He didn't really attend adult options. Then in '76, Jack Sharp came, and Jack came from an urban ministry in Wilmington, Delaware, and interested in urban ministry, and the church brought him in because of that interest. And Jack was interested because the manse had been moved out of, and there was a program that came in to that was involving people in the neighborhood.
David, before you get into Jack's period, Adam and Beth asked if you could mention Govans' stance regarding the desegregation of Gwynn Oak Park in Woodlawn.
Yes.
Which was
Gwynn Oak Park, the stated clerk, the highest paid person on the National Presbyterian Church administrative staff at the time, the Northern Presbyterian Church, came down and with the Presbyterian executive here in Baltimore and other active people, went over to integrate Gwynn Oak Park, which was the, place where you rode rides, et cetera, and mixed, which was very segregated, and confronted them. Then they wouldn't let them in. Dr. Ice at the time was part of Presbytery leading that, oh, we're for change, et cetera, but we're not for protests and we're not for demonstrations. We don't like that. And he led the charge for that in Presbytery. He didn't say much at Govans, was sort of neutral, trying to keep the peace. But that's what happened. And I think there were some Govans people who went over to Gwynn Oak Park as well. But the church itself was not, and the pastor was really against that sort of thing. Dr. Ice had been a leader of that when it happened.
David, maybe this is a good point. Just a quick question. So, in reconstructing what happened in those cases, who did what, who said what they was this from talking from the oral histories when you talk to people?
All of the stuff,
documents.
all the stuff I'm sharing came from interviews. So it's different than documentation. We've got to document this and get, dates clear. I shared some of them with you. I had to dig for that outside of the interviews. I mean, some of them were buried in there. But these are just from interviews and people sharing their recollections, like you say, oral history. So it's a story more than is not documentation at this point.
Okay, thanks.
But those are what we're sharing, I believe, and I clarified that in my meeting with the three of them on Friday. I think they're factually based. There's not a lot of debate about what I've shared as in terms of being factual. Okay, we need to have time for questions. We're running out. I'll just quickly go into Jack Sharp era, which is a real explosion. Jack getting into relating with pastors in the community, including African-American churches, with exchanges and other things, founding of the different homes. And the main emphasis I'll say, which is way too much of a summary, but the truth is in founding GEDCO, and that meant involvement in the community and in racial justice issues, among other things, with people who were deprived, seniors, disabled people, people coming out of being homeless, etc., which was more than just racial initiation, but full-body community involvement with people in need. And then to the final thing of starting Stadium Place, but started CARES, all of that folded in, and the church really changed its orientation. And then with Tom's coming, I'll just suffice it to say, a lot of you know that history, but in rising to the point of bringing in Leah, first for music, and then as racial justice minister, and starting the racial justice ministry group a year ago, and Govans officially adopting a policy of being anti-racist and wants to move in that ministry. And I need to say, we're just, not only is the racial justice ministry group just starting, but Govans as a church that has an anti-racial stance is just starting. The main thing we've done at Govans is reading books and educating ourselves and having people of color participate in those book discussions and in the racial justice ministry group. And I'm giving that short shrift, but I want to have time for questions for Beth and Bill to make any comments. I've skipped over a lot, but the time is getting late, so I'll stop.
Thank you, David. So Susan has a comment in the chat, which is about the history that Brown Memorial brings in. Susan, if you'd like to unmute yourself, I think that'd be great if you could describe Brown's different experience.
Yes. So I was in college at the time, and we had been longtime members of Towson Presbyterian Church. But my father called me and he said that not very long before this happened, the pastor at Towson Presbyterian Church had announced to the congregation that if you must bring a Negro to church, please make sure somebody in your family sits on either side of them so as not to disturb the rest of the congregation. And the next thing that happened was that John Madaw, the pastor at Brown Memorial, got arrested in those demonstrations at Gwen Oak. And my father called me and he said, "We're changing churches. You want to come with us?" And I said, yes. So not everybody who came from Brown came at that time, but that was the main reason we came, was to avoid what was going on at Towson and to find something different. I wanted to say something else though, because I think that some of the other things that are happening in the community are more than just reading. You're doing these podcasts with people from the neighborhood. Leah's connection with Govans Elementary School and starting a choir there is powerful, because my other history is that Larry and I moved into Govans while white people were fleeing. And we had a little hard time doing it because, you know, they were hoping to flip the neighborhood and they really didn't want to sell to us. But once that happened, I think things settled down a little bit and our part of the neighborhood became more integrated and has stayed that way. Anyway, that's what I had to say.
The schools were integrated in the 60s. There's lots I'm leaving out. There's just not enough time to get into all of it. Thank you very much, Susan. Beth or Bill, do you want to add anything at this point?
Well, you said the schools were integrated in the 50s.
50s. All right, I'm sorry.
Holly was actually integrated before Brown versus the Board of Education. That's what Jim Addy told me. He was a class of 51 and Polly was integrated in 52.
Okay.
And it was through involvement of the NAACP.
Okay. I was thinking, I thought I understood that the Govans Elementary School was integrated in the 60s just because of who was in the neighborhood, but maybe it was broader. Okay. I think Bill's frozen.
He was head of the history department at Baltimore City College for a year. And then he wanted to go to Dunbar, and he went to Dunbar to be to teach history there for a number of years.
Beth, do you want to add anything?
No.
Okay.
I have a question. It's good.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go on. So where was the church at large? The Presbyterian Church USA, right?
Yes.
What was their stance? Were they encouraging,
Well, the Presbyterian Church in 1960 was still divided between the northern and southern churches. They weren't united until what, 1967?
Oh, 83.
80 something.
83, okay. Towson.
Oh, we lost one again.
Bill, we can't hear you.
Towson was a southern church, is what he's trying to tell you.
Yes. Now, the main thing is
You can go ahead and-
answer the question, because I was involved starting.
And his church in Atlanta, which he was a very famous minister in Atlanta, was the most southern of the Northern Presbyterian Church. And his grandfather did the Protestant Hour on TV and the radio. And Barry has said that he remembers sitting on his grandfather's lap while he would, preach on the radio. So there are a lot of, I don't know, there are a lot of just different connections here between North and South and white, black. I mean, it's
Well,
a real mixed.
To answer your question, policy-wise, starting in the 60s, the General Assembly started having very strong statements. The big thing in the church was at General Assembly level, a national level, was passing resolutions and statements, and they were very much involved in racial justice kinds of statements. And they had Angela Davis come and speak to the General Assembly, and James Farmer and others. And like in my church in Amarillo and a lot of Presbyterian churches, they were very unhappy. So the Presbyterian church was in turmoil in those days. But General Assembly is representative of all the churches, and there were a lot of very progressive stuff coming out and involvement going on. But there was a majority of members probably out in the churches that were not happy with that in the 60s, and that slowly began to change, and in part because people left the denomination. And the Southern Church began to grow. So in 83, when they joined, they were fairly united. There was no backtracking and even further involvement, statements, and ministries in terms of racial justice. But that's another huge topic to get and explore.
I'm just going to interrupt for a second. It's 6 of, so anybody who wants to go to the second service, don't feel embarrassed about leaving, whether it's on Zoom or in the room. I don't know, David, if you want to, if you can linger a few more minutes to talk a bit more if there are further questions. I'm happy to stay here as well, but anybody wants to go to the service, please do so.
I just want to make one statement, and that's the foundation that was created in the 50s and the 60s with the social interaction that we had from the action and the involvement in the community, such as the McKim Center, which we still support as a congregation, is something that I think we should remember, is that Govans has been a leader in actual involvement in interracial work for many, many years. So
I'll support that in that my mother was on the board of McKim Center for 50 years until she died.
we still support it, and it's still doing great work.
Yeah, we had a visitor from them a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Before we shut down for COVID.
Well,
Thanks, Kate.
one thing I want to say is ministers were involved out in the community and other people down in McKim, et cetera.
A lot of interactions between McKim and Govans.
The difficulty is that the church itself and its members, it was only a small portion that were involved. Govans as a whole, even in Jack's era, did not have large groups out involved in racial justice ministry. And as far out as he was, the individual members were not all that active as a whole in that, and we have to own that. But leadership and initiatives began to happen until we'll have to see. We have the Racial Justice Ministry Group and Leah and all that's going on, but we're just now starting to really pull on the membership. And I say that not in terms of how integrated we can become. I mean, that's a slice, yes, but just in terms of racial justice, period,
Yeah.
getting the majority of members behind it.
I mean, having grown up in the church in the 60s, I wouldn't say Govans was a progressive congregation, okay? It frustrated me. But a lot of the seeds were planted in that time that are coming to bear in where we are today. I mean, I have to say that we're in a position now from a lot of things of actions that certain individuals took a long time ago. But as a congregation, there was it was very passive.
And if you're not anti-racist, we can get into that. That's why we talk about being anti-racist. Just to be pro is not enough. You have to be involved in action and ministry. And we're getting there without Jack Sharp. And one of the things I didn't mention just quickly is Jack Sharp was very involved with integrating Govans and standing behind gay rights. And we became a more light church with some resistance, but he artfully managed that till we adopted that. And I would say today we're open that way. So there are other areas in terms of justice, but our focus is racial justice.
David, I wanted to say just one more thing about the education. You're right. The schools were integrated in the 1950s, but I don't think Govans was integrated until the 60s. And it was only integrated.
I don't think it wasn't integrated in the 60s. I don't ever remember.
What I'm saying, this is what I'm saying. Only when Black kids started to move into the neighborhood. So we moved into our house in 70, and that point the neighborhood was changing. So for about 5 minutes, Govans Elementary School was integrated, and now it's segregated again.
Yeah, I'm not talking about Govans Elementary. I'm talking about the Baltimore City schools.
Well, but in our neighborhood, Govans and the junior high school, whose name I've forgotten, Chinkapin, those schools were segregated white and then became integrated for about 5 minutes until the neighborhood looked like it was changing. And the white people that moved into my neighborhood wanted to be integrated, but they didn't like the public school system. So most of us sent our kids to someplace else. And now there are these magnet schools and stuff like that. For a while, when our neighborhood was changing, the white parents would only stay until their kids entered school and then they'd leave. Now we've got people staying all the way through, but they still don't trust the public school system. So, I mean, I think that's something we need to think about, and why I was so glad that Leah got involved with Govans Elementary School.
Oh, yeah, that's.
I went to Roland Park, and it was integrated in the 50s because I was there in the 50s. So Roland Park Elementary and junior high was integrated because we lived in the neighborhood also, but we were sent to public schools.
I was at Roland Park, and that was integrated. I went there in 1961, and that was an integrated school.
And I was there in 54.
I'm sorry. Adam and Beth patiently had their hand up for a while.
Oh,
Adam?
Yeah, I just want to mention that even though technically a school is integrated, that doesn't mean that African-American students and their parents have equal access to that school that white children have. That can be decades between the time when on paper they will allow African-American children into the school and the time when African-American parents, their kids have equal access to that school.
No, you're right on that. And there was there was a lot of opposition to it. Yeah, there's no question about that.
Well, one of the things to say is, let me just put an analogy, and that is that a lot of progress supposedly was made in the 60s, but it was on paper, and now we're even backtracking. For example, with voting, equal access, with gerrymandering and these laws that states are passing, it's very difficult and hard. There's a lot, we try to deal with sort of the top of the iceberg. There's so much that needs to happen. And of course, Govans can't take over the culture with its attitudes, and even our congregation. We just have to make the commitments we're making and do the work we can do one at a time and be a candle in the darkness.
And remember that Martin Luther King, I believe, said that the law is just a promise. You know,
Yep.
it just says this is where we want to be. It takes people who love justice and who make it what it should be, what society should be. But
Yep.
laws are just, you know, I've seen kids in supposedly integrated schools who are not white, our daughter among them, be singled out for special, you know, discipline and
constantly watched and basically drummed out of the school.
right.
And parents who wanted, African-American parents who want to register their children at a school that's supposed to be integrated, roadblocks are put in their way, they're discouraged, their applications are lost, child shows up, first day of school,
No,
oh,
I-
you never registered.
You're right. It's not the law. It's we have to change people's hearts and minds. And the law, you know, we can try to enforce it, but the law doesn't change people's hearts and minds.
And I think somebody made that point very clearly about the congregations, because we've had very active, proactive people in our congregations, but that doesn't mean the congregation is in that situation.
Well, that's what I was trying to say. And
I think that's a really valid point.
We were not what I would call a progressive congregation.
Yeah. I sort of learned in our old church that mission is not about what check you can write and what good feeling you can have. If it doesn't change you personally, it's not really mission.
Well, one of the things I would say in conclusion, I was taught a lot about love interpersonally, you know, loving others. And I was taught a lot about charity and all the years I was growing up, but I never heard one sermon on justice. And what you're talking about, Susan, is moving into justice, moving into loving our neighbor and our enemy, and equal rights, equal everything. And we're very far from actuality on that. Although initiatives are starting and happening, it's not stagnant exactly. There's things happening, including like us, and those things from the bottom up have got to, push, lead the way, witness to it, specifically, actually, mentally and physically.
And remember, we're also kind of going against headwinds of the way our theology's been delivered to us. Our theology, at least in the Protestant sphere, from what I can understand of it, really has to do with our personal relationship to God. You know, so basically everything that you do is because God wants you to do it. But we in that have lost the whole social attitude of, you know, we want to help bring the kingdom, the order of God, where everybody has enough and where it doesn't matter what color or what language or what, but you are still treated as a child of God, and you still have those opportunities, and you still have that. So anyway, with that, I'm done.
Well, I just want to second what Adam is saying. Not that he needs my second, but it's that my personal relationship to God. But when we start to work in community, when we work together, and it's not just me and God, but it's us and God, that's what starts to make the difference, I think.
Well, I want to go in. I just preached a sermon on this. We're not going to make much progress unless we're spiritually developing, that we're on the journey of becoming disciples. Because I was involved in the 60s when, even in seminary, we got really active, but we weren't nurturing our spiritual life. And that only has so much energy. To do it right way, to do it the nonviolent way, for example, requires deep spiritual energy. So we need to foster most. And I'll conclude with my statement. It's Micah 6:8. And what will I come before the Lord? And a lot of stuff, our worship, etc., is not the important part. It's really simple. Is to love mercy, do justice, and walk humbly with your God. it's a three-legged stool. And that's what we have to have. And we as a church need both true spiritual development, becoming true disciples, and we can't even begin to do that unless we're also active in the real world in terms of justice, loving our enemies, loving even those who perpetuate gross injustice, loving them but not supporting them, opposing them. Okay.
Thanks again, David.
Well done, David.
Thank you,
Boy,
David.
looking forward to Myra's talk next week. We'll be starting at 10. There's a single service next week. 11. At 11 with Knox Presbyterian. And so we're going to make sure that everybody can make that. We'll start a little bit earlier. And I suspect that Myra, like David, also has far more fascinating material than you could possibly go through one session. But remember, this is an ongoing process. David's going to get another shot. We're going to learn a lot more. So thanks again. Thanks everybody for joining us. And
Thanks,
I'll
David.
I'll make sure that we'll make this recording somehow available to the congregation. We'll figure out how to do that. Okay.
Thank you all.
Take care.
Great week. Bye-bye, everybody.
Safe.